All right, hello everyone. My name is Amanda Wallmeyer, and I am the local history librarian here at Johnson County Library. Thank you all for attending today's program, The Past is Prologue, Immigration in Kansas Today. The Past is Prologue is a bi-monthly program offered by Johnson County Library, where we highlight topics that are often left out, glossed over, or misrepresented in our history books. We would also like to begin today with a brief land acknowledgement. Our Kansas City institutions stand on the homelands of Native American peoples at the juncture of the Missouri and Kansas rivers. In recent years, these nations have included the Delaware, Kansas, Missouri, Oto, Osage, and Shawnee. We pay respects to all Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, for their continuing presence in this land and the land where you may be joining us from tonight. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Sanderson.
Well, thank you, Amanda, for the opportunity to be with you tonight and to be with your guests as well. It's a pleasure to be with you, even if it is in the format I prefer less when compared to in person. But thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'm happy to share some insights from my own research on immigration in different parts of the world, but especially in the Great Plains region. And Kansas in particular. I'll come back. My talk is titled Immigration in Kansas, Then, Now, Why? And I'll come back to this picture here as we get toward the end of the presentation. I thought I'd start out with an initial thought about immigration in general and in the United States. We're really a part of, in the United States, one big, messy, complicated, wonderful, terrifying, inspiring experiment. Some would call it a project. And it's an experiment or a project in self-government, in identity and identity formation, and in a project of development as a country, socioeconomic, cultural development. And immigration is a glimpse. It provides a lens into this project, this experiment that is the United States. So an overview of the talk tonight, I'll talk mainly about immigration in Kansas from a historical perspective up to the present day. And I'll talk in the context of that, I'll talk in particular about some significant shifts and changes that have occurred in the population of Kansas over time. And I'll mention one significant explanation of those shifts and changes. Okay, and then as a closing, I'll ask sort of a moral ethical question about immigration that I think is very important to keep in mind when we're discussing immigration and immigrants. So just a very quick background on me. I'm a social scientist. I'm a sociologist by training. I study development, and I especially study community development. Most of my work focuses on population and community as aspects of development. And a word on immigration as a part of this of my work. I really backed into immigration. I didn't set out to study it when I went to graduate school. I read a lot and did a lot of work on development, the process of international development in particular, and always in my work, I was coming into work on immigrants and immigration and population movements as aspects of change, as aspects of how societies develop over time and across countries. And so I don't enter the conversation about immigration with overt political intentions or motivations. And I think that's important to say up front because the topic of immigration is very political and it's very politicized. But I approach the topic of immigration as a social scientist grounded in the data and the evidence on what's happened with immigrants and immigration, and then why, trying to understand why people move and why they stay put and so on. So I really started thinking about immigration, as I said, in graduate school, when I had a chance to visit Ciudad Juarez Juarez city in Mexico on the border across from El Paso as a graduate student, and we were working on a research project interviewing migrants who had moved from the interior of Mexico up to the border of Mexico and the U.S. And I met this gentleman here. I didn't know his name, on a bus as we were being taken out. I was riding a bus out with the maquiladora workers to the colonias, these sort of ramshackle urban areas that have very limited infrastructure. And I met this guy. I was in graduate school at the University of Utah, and in my 20s, mid-20s, and I had met this individual, ran into him, and I noticed him because he had a shirt on that had, if you can see, I don't know how closely you can see the screen, but he's wearing a shirt that has a U.S. flag, and in the corner where the stars would be, there's the state flag of Kansas. And being from Kansas, I'm a fifth-generation Kansan. I moved back to Kansas to be here at home in Kansas, and that struck me in the middle of Juarez. I'm asking, we started a conversation about his shirt and the state of Kansas, and I'll come back to this gentleman toward the end. But this person really forced me to reflect on immigration in a way that I had not as a graduate student, but also as a citizen of the United States. So let's talk a little bit about the facts and figures. If we go back, immigration in Kansas then, in the past, has been studied by lots of people. There's a series of very dense atlases, maps created by J. Neil Carman, who I understand was a professor at KU into the 1960s. And J. Neil Carman put together a 3-volume set called Foreign Language Units of Kansas. It's a fascinating resource for those looking to understand more about the immigrant history of the state. He puts together several maps as a part of this collection. One of them, I'm going to show you a few. This is the percentage of foreign language speaking populations in Kansas in 1895 by counties, basically. And so the darker shaded areas have more dense settlements of foreign language speaking populations. These are folks we would call immigrants, right? And what you can see from this map in 1895, before the turn of the 20th century, is that Kansas was a mosaic. Kansas has a lot of diversity at the turn of the 20th century. I'm going to show you a second map that will carry on this theme. If you look at it differently, these are land holdings of foreign-born immigrants in Kansas. I think it's the same year, or right around the turn of the 20th century. And yellow are German foreign-born persons. Red are Scandinavian-born persons. Blue is labeled Slav or Slavic. There's sort of a hash, a yellow and black hash that are Welsh. Black is French. There's Dutch. You can see the picture here. Kansas was really at the late 1800s, early 1900s, a very diverse place in terms of immigrant populations. So there's a couple things I want to take away from these first two slides. Early on, we know that there were a mix of at least 8, and some have gone as high as over 30 different dialects and languages being spoken in the state at the turn of the 20th century. English, there were many variants of German, several variants of French. There was Swedish. Spanish was certainly spoken as well. It's a very diverse linguistic population in this state of Kansas. And two, Germans were predominant among the immigrant population in Kansas. And Carmen notes in the book that, I'm taking a quote here, that the German communities tended to have had rather close relations with each other and with few outside their county. So German-speaking populations, he noted, were pretty insular, pretty cliquish, pretty set apart from non-German speaking populations. That's an important point when we come to think about immigrant populations that are currently with us today. So as we move forward into today, what we see is really in the state of Kansas, but also in the country, a shift in the types of immigrants that are deemed less desirable. Okay, and we're gonna walk through this. So again, looking back at 1900, state of Kansas, very diverse. Okay, also among the foreign-born populations, Germans clearly stand out. But then, this is a cartoon from 1853, mid-19th century, and it was a cartoon for the anti-immigrant Know Nothing Party, as they called themselves. And it was accusing Irish and Germans of rigging elections, right? This is the German, this is the Irishman in an Irish whiskey barrel, and on the right is presumably a German who's in a beer or lager barrel, and they are carrying away the ballot box. This was a cartoon for, again, a political party. So immigration has been politicized for a very long time in our country. And it was once the Germans and the Irish, right, and the Italians, and we could go on, who were the subject of anti-immigrant sentiment. The Know Nothing Party actually rose to quite a bit of prominence in the country. Adherents were asked to reply and say things like, "I know nothing," when asked if they were a part of this effort. On the right, Uncle Sam's youngest son, it says, "Citizen Know Nothing." This was presumably the embodiment of what an American should look like. Clearly, a person of English ancestry is the ideal from this particular point of view. This party actually nominated President Millard Fillmore in 1856 presidential election. And Fillmore had been the 13th president of the country. And he had become president after Zachary Taylor died in office in 1850. He received 21.5% of the vote, not enough to win the election in the 1856 election. But a significant minority of people in the United States voted for the Know Nothing candidate in the election that James Buchanan ends up winning. The Know Nothings sort of dissolved, and many were brought into what is now what became the Republican Party at the time. So again, the U.S. is one big experiment, one big project, and the sentiments we hear about immigrants today are not particularly new, but they have been with us a very long time. But what's changed is the different form. So opposition to immigrants has a long history in our country, and it does include some that would be considered our founding fathers. So Benjamin Franklin among them was many things and did many good things for the country. He was our first ambassador to France and Sweden. He was a newspaper editor. He was the first postmaster general for the colonies. He was an inventor. He founded an Ivy League university. He was an abolitionist. Although he owned slaves prior, he became an abolitionist in the 1750s. He was many things. He also vehemently opposed German immigration to the country. In a series of letters, one called Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, the Peopling of Countries, etc. In 1751, Benjamin Franklin wrote about the Germans, speaking immigrants. Why should the Palatine Boers, the German-speaking immigrants, be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their languages and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them? And never will they adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion. But, he says, perhaps I am partial to the complexion of my country, for such kind of partiality is natural to mankind. So anti-immigrant sentiment is not new. What is new is what's changed. The groups have changed, right? Benjamin Franklin speaking about German-speaking immigrants in 1751. These were common, and it wasn't just German. These are signs in newspaper. These are newspaper ads that I pulled out of historical archives here. No Irish need apply. Help wanted, no Irish need apply. Signs in windows, of course. Here, a German Protestant, in this particular ad, a German Protestant is wanted, but not an Irish person. They want a Protestant girl. They don't want an Irish person. You see, this stuff, it starts to get confusing. Greeks, a first-class shoemaker wanted to do repair work, must be steady and sober. At the end, no Greeks need apply. Italians, right? Here's an ad showing an Italian shoe shining person. It's complicated. Here's an ad that wants 40 laborers at $2.25 wages. Only Americans, Scandinavians, Irish, English, or Germans need apply to the Tacoma Smelting Company. Right? So we've had a long history of being selective. Today, right, and this is where we start to see the shift into today now. So today, what's happened to German immigrants? Well, Americans of German ancestry today outnumber any other ethnic group in the United States. Right? And German customs, German traditions have become predominant in American culture. Kindergarten is a German, was brought by German immigrants to the country. The idea of Christmas trees, Oktoberfest, these are parts of American culture that were brought by Germans who were once very, very despised immigrants. And the Irish too. St. Patrick's Day, here's the Fighting Irishman of Notre Dame. These things have become part of American culture. But today, so what's happened, right? What's happened is we still have anti-immigrant sentiment. This is not new with us. It's been a part of America since the founding. What's changed is the groups, right? So today we have new outgroups. This is a cartoon, and it was right around the time that Ronald Reagan signed the amnesty bill, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. This was in the California Fullerton Daily News. This is a Mexican, it says Mexican peon coming across the United States border while ostensibly the security, the immigration authorities in the U.S. are just sort of standing there letting him come in. And he's carrying, the Mexican immigrant is carrying ignorance and disregard for the law, right, in his bag across the border. So this is not new. The groups have changed, right? And we struggle with this issue of immigration in Kansas too, just like the broader broader country. This is an ad that I pulled out when I was down in Garden City, Dodge City area in summer of 2012. This character is the High Plains Drifter from Clint Eastwood's movie, and he's zigzagging back and forth between two signs. One that says amnesty, one that says deport them all. And it's the High Plains Drifter. We sort of move in waves between these two sentiments, between allowing immigrants in and wanting to deport them, build walls, and so on and so forth. We move back and forth throughout American history in these positions. In Kansas, what have we seen? Well, this is the population of the state of Kansas, the total population since the very first census was taken in 1870, all the way till the most current census in 2020. This is our total population. We're a growing state, but we are growing quite a bit slower than a couple of our neighbors, and slower than the national average overall. What's happened to our immigrant population in these numbers? Well, this graph shows on the left, right, the total population of the state, and on the right is the percentage of foreign-born in our population. And on the x-axis is years or time, right? So as you move from left to right, you see change in these two trends I'm about ready to talk about over time, from 1870 till 2020. What's happened with our population? What's happened with our immigrant population? Well, in 1870, at the first census that was taken in the state after statehood, we were much smaller than today, and we were more diverse. We had a population in the state of 364,000 people. It's about 10% of our population today. Today, we have about 3 million people living in the state. We had 364,000 people, and we were 14% foreign born. So 14% of our population were immigrants at the founding of the state, or shortly thereafter in 1870. Okay, you fast forward 100 years, right? 100 years to 1970, right? Nobody alive in 1870 lived to see the population in 1970, but here's what happened. In 1970, we were larger. We grew from, over that 100 years, from 360,000 people to 2.2 million. Quite a bit larger. That's the blue line you see, right? But we were 1% foreign born by 1970. That's the red line. That's the downward line. So in 100 years, we went from 14% foreign born to 1%, and we got larger, right? Fast forward from 1970 to 2020, 2010, we're about 3 million people, and we're about 6 to 7% foreign born. So we have seen an increase in the percentage foreign born compared to 1970, but we're only about half the foreign born population we have today compared to where we were at the founding of the state in 1870. All right, so that's what's happened just in terms of the census numbers in the state since the founding. 150 years in this graph. How do we compare to the US? Well, here again, we'll see number of immigrants and immigrants as a percent of the population. And this is from 1850 until 2011, right? Again, in the beginning of the country, or earlier on in 1850, we have a high proportion of immigrants. Immigrants are about 15% of the population. It's about like Kansas at our founding. And we have a relatively low number of immigrants in the state. As we shift ahead from 1910 to 1960, we see a very sharp drop in immigrants as a proportion of our population, from something like 15% down to about 5%. and immigrants decline in numbers as well. Between 1910 and 1960, we see a big shift. After 1960, we see a rise back up to the historical average norm, right? 2011, 2012 into today, we're about 15% foreign born again in the country, and immigrants have risen to a high in our country again. But we are back as a percentage of the population right back where we were in the early 20th century, late 19th century. So I'm going to come back to this a couple different times. So today, right, we reverted back to where we were early on, and there's this weird kind of time period from 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s that we see a dip in immigration. What has changed, right, is not the percentage of immigrants necessarily in our population, but the origins of our immigrants have changed. So in the early or mid 20th century, 1960s, right? This is the regional origins of immigrants to the country from 1960 to 2010. What do we see? Well, in 1960, we were getting most of our immigrants from Europe, Eastern Europe in particular. 1980, it's still roughly the same, but more immigrants are coming from Latin America and the Caribbean, right? Today, most of our immigrants are coming from Latin America, South America, Central America, and Asia. So we've seen a decline in European immigrants and a rise in immigrants from what we would consider non-traditional sending regions in the early 20th century. So what has changed are the origins of immigrants, not necessarily immigrants as a percentage of the population in the long term. Kansas, too, has seen this very same shift. So in 1900, right, this is foreign-born Germans as a percent of all immigrants in the state. Germans were the predominant foreign-born population in our state in 1900. Today, they're negligible, less than 1%, right? Okay. What's shifted, right, is over time, this is foreign-born Mexicans. So Mexican immigrants in the state. Mexican immigrants are now half of all immigrants in the state of Kansas. German immigrants, if I go back, German immigrants were roughly about 40% of all immigrants in the early 1900s. Today, right, Mexican immigrants are the predominant group, a foreign-born group in the state of Kansas, and it's about 45%. Okay, so what has changed is a shift in the origins or the starting points of our immigrant population. So we put these together now in one place, and we see the two graphs. We see that U-shaped pattern take hold or become apparent again. In the state of Kansas in 1870, right, German immigrants were about 3.5% of our population, our total percent. Today, they've declined to somewhere near negligible. And today, Mexican immigrants are about 3% of our population in the state of Kansas. Okay. So why did this change? This is a complicated question, right? So why do we see the shift from these populations? Why do we see the ethnic change? Why do we see the decrease? This is a long, complicated discussion, but I want to bring out one factor in particular that's important to the story. Again, we are a country of immigrants. It is true, but that is also very complicated. We've always struggled with questions of who belongs, who doesn't, and who gets to say who belongs and who doesn't. We've always struggled with those questions. Only thing that's changed is the groups. Okay, these are quintessentially American questions. They are embodied in our policies. So policy is very important for understanding the shift in the types of immigrants we get and the timing of these immigrants. It's our policies. It's our decisions on who gets in and who doesn't that changes the orientation and the structure of immigration in the country and in the state of Kansas. So these are just a few of our policies over time. What have we said about immigrants? Well, we can look at immigrant sentiment by looking at policies over time in the country. The first major immigration-related policy in the country was the Naturalization Act of 1790. It was the first policy we had, and it granted citizenship. The first policy for granting citizenship, 1790. It limited naturalization, so it limited who could become a naturalized citizen to free white persons and persons of good moral character who had been in the U.S. for 2 years. That was our rule in 1790. It also established the children of citizens as citizens. We amended the Constitution. We skipped forward 70 plus years, 80 years. We amended the Constitution, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution in 1868 after the Civil War, gives citizenship to people born in the U.S. regardless of race, citizenship, or place of birth. Birthright citizenship, in other words. It notably did not include untaxed Native Americans, who were only granted citizenship in the 20th century, 1924, by the Indian Citizenship Act. So again, our policies are important. These were two big ones early on. Then the Page Act of 1875 in Reconstruction, it's the first federal policy to actually restrict immigration. Before this point, we had no restrictions on immigration before 1875. Okay, it restricted undesirable immigration to this group: Asian men arriving as forced laborers and Asian women engaged in prostitution, along with convicts. Now again, this was following the gold rush of 1848 and the railroad constructions, which were, of course, attracting a lot of Asian immigration. Page Act of 1875 was important to understanding how we viewed immigrants. Following that, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which finally prohibited all Chinese immigration. It was renewed 10 years later. It was made permanent 10 years after that in 1902. And it was only repealed in World War II in 1943. Okay, again, two more pieces to the story of our policies about why things have shifted over time. But the big one in terms of our story here is what was called the Emergency Quota Acts of 1921 through 24, which explicitly used a race-based measure to limit immigration to the United States. Okay, it limited immigration to 3% of the foreign-born population of each nationality in the U.S. in 1910. So effectively, it put into it was called the system of quotas, or the national origins formula. It put into a race-based, ethnic-based measure for limiting immigration so that the country would stay racially and ethnically as it was in 1910 indefinitely. And that was a predominantly white country, or what we today understand as a white country, right? The objective was to maintain the composition of the United States racially and ethnically in 1910 indefinitely. So this Emergency Quota Act of 1920s tells us a lot about why we see the dramatic decline in immigrants and the types of immigrants into the mid-20th century. Then we got a very big change in the mid-60s. It's called the Hart-Celler Act, or the Immigration and Nationality Act. This is Lyndon B. Johnson signing it at Ellis Island in 1965. And it was the beginning of a very large shift in the types of immigrants U.S. was open to. It shifted flows from Europe to Asia and South America, which then became the main sending regions. And it was the beginning of undocumented immigration from Mexico. This is a long, complicated story, but this was an important piece. The Hart-Celler Act was an important piece of legislation that really shifted the tide of immigration into the country. I'm gonna move through these. We can go back. What we see then from these policies from 1790 till 1965 is that policy drives, right, the numbers and the proportions. So what we have really is, in terms of today, is a return to a historical norm in the country. And I know that's hard to understand, especially when the rhetoric and the discussion about immigration in the country is very often hot, and it's described in all kinds of metaphors about waves and flood tides and so on. But we have not seen a flood tide of immigrants to the country if you look at immigrants as a percentage of the country. In fact, what we have seen is a return to where we were originally, right? But here's the sticking point, right? I'm going to move through this. This is how we talk about this, right? In terms of we think this era that we're in now is new, and that we're receiving all these new immigrants, and where immigration is at all-time highs. And again, marine metaphors, floods, tides, waves, these sorts of things are in the discussions. But here's the point, that if you were born between even 1930, but certainly if you were born between 1940 and 1970, it feels like immigration is at an all-time high. It makes sense, right? These two bars here denote 1940 to 1970. Let's look at what happened. Immigration was at all-time lows, very unusual lows from this particular time period. And it was because of the 1921 Quota Act. It worked, right? Policy worked. When we restricted immigration to 3% of the national population in 1910, the country came to resemble what we wanted what the policy was designed to make the country look like. When the Quota Acts were overturned in 1965, we start to get a return to a historical norm of somewhere around 15% of the country being foreign born. But if you were born and socialized and grew up, right, in your formative years between 1940 and 1970 in the country or in Kansas, right, you grew up during a pretty unusual, some might say weird time. It was a time when immigration was at all-time lows and the country was never more white in racial and ethnic composition. But never before that point, and certainly not after the 1980s, have we looked like that. The 40s through the 70s was a very different time period. And no one alive, right, has seen the entire scope of this graph in their life. They haven't lived long enough. No one today was around in 1890 when the country or the state was 15% foreign born. Okay, but that's where we are. We're right back where we were, but nobody's around to remember that. So it does seem like a flood tide has hit us, but it depends on your reference period. It depends on your reference period. Okay, in the long view, it's what we went through is not unusual right now. What was unusual was the 40s to the 70s. That was unusual. I think this is very important for understanding the discussion around immigration in the country today. Okay, all right. So I want to conclude now. That's enough of the facts and figures. And I thought I'd conclude by asking sort of a moral ethical question. It's a philosophical question. It's designed to have you think about what if sort of scenarios. And it's from John Rawls, a philosopher at Harvard many years ago. He asked us to think about what rules would we create if we were behind a veil of ignorance. Okay, those rules, roughly, he's saying, paraphrasing, right? Those rules, principles that we would agree to from behind a veil of ignorance, those rules are just, those rules are fair. Those rules that we do not or would not agree to from behind a veil of ignorance are unjust. They're unfair. Okay. So this is what he asks us to imagine. It's 24 hours before your birth, and you know nothing about what race you're going to be born into, what your gender is going to be, who your parents are going to be, where you're going to live, whether you're going to live in Johnson County or whether you're going to live in Western Kansas, whether you're going to live in Kansas or whether you're going to live in Alabama, whether you're going to be born in the United States or whether you're going to be born in Zimbabwe. You have no idea. You're looking down at Earth 24 hours before your birth. You know nothing about the factors that we know will impact your life. What rules would you agree to, knowing nothing about what you are headed into? Those rules are fair and just rules. If you would not agree to a rule, not knowing any of those things, we have an unjust, unfair rule. Okay, keep that in mind. Now, I'll ask you, what were the odds, right? Presumably, most of us on the call, the talk tonight are from the area or around the area. What were the odds that you were randomly assigned the United States as a country of birth if you were born here? We get no choice about that, of course. Nobody chooses from pre-birth where they're going to enter, right? Nobody gets to choose, oh, I'll take myself, right? I did not get a choice prior to being born that I was going to be born a white male in the United States. But those three things tend to turn out to be determinative of what I could do with my life. Okay, and I didn't get a choice. So what were the odds of this, right? What were the odds? Well, we can calculate very simple odds. This is from this morning. I took it from the census clock. If you go to the census or the population bureau, it'll show you the US population clock and the world population clock, and they're spinning, and it's humbling to sit there and watch the population just expand very quickly. We have one birth, for example, every 9 seconds in the country, a new baby's born, and one death every 11 seconds, right? One new international migrant every 130 seconds, right? We're the third largest country in the world. We have 331 million people behind India and China. What were the odds a baby born today anywhere in the world ends up here in the United States? Well, the simple odds are about 4%. We're the third largest country in the world. We have 331 million people, but the world has 7.8 billion. US is only 4% of the entire world's population. So roughly the odds of a baby being born today somewhere in the world being born here in the United States, 96% against the odds of being born here. And nobody got a choice, right? Okay, what were the odds around the world, right? What are the odds that you would live in a place, right, somewhere in the world that's living on less than $2.50 per person per day? The odds are about 50%. All right, so 1 in 2 babies being born today, roughly, simple odds, in the world is going to be born into a family or a household that's living on less than $2.50 US a day. And 8 in 10, 80%, right, of new babies are going to live somewhere less than $10 US per day. The average income in the world, average annual income in the world, adjusted for differences in cost of living, we call that purchasing power parity, is about $9,500 per year. So if you line everybody up in the world, all 7.8 billion of us, and you ask us their incomes, what they're living on annually, about 10,000 US dollars a year is the middle person, right? Okay, well, the average personal income in the United States is about $34,000-$35,000 a year. And the average household in the United States earns about $55,000-$56,000 a year. Right? So the average American household is earning somewhere between 5 and 6 times the average middle class person in the world. This is an incredibly rare situation we're in the United States. If a baby is born here, it's about 4% chance of being born here. And when you're born here, you basically hit a chance at the lottery, a chance at $55,000 a year, which is 5 to 6 times the average middle class income in the world. The odds were much greater you would have ended up in a place on $10 a day or $2.50 a day, much greater if you take the word. But where you start shapes so much. The data I'm going to show you here come from the World Bank. There's a series of World Bank studies on what factors predict a person's annual income. And the data sets are huge. I mean, they're in the billions of data points that used to construct these models. And what comes out of it is, what explains someone's annual lifetime income? Really the factors come down to 3 factors, right? The largest prediction of what you will earn in a year is your country of birth. If you just know someone's country of birth, you can predict on average 60% of all the variation in incomes in the world. Very powerful explanation. What country were you born in? 20% of a person's annual earnings is attributable to what their parents earned, parents' social class. And 20% is other, and it includes things like gender, it includes things like personal motivation, ambition, all the personal characteristics like motivation, all the stuff we focus on, especially in the self-help books, all the things that you should be doing as an individual to increase your income, all that stuff gets dumped into the 20%. But 80% of your income is what country were you born in and what are your parents' social class. We can predict 80% of variation in incomes across the world, in variation across the world. And last I checked, right, this is an important point, nobody picks their parents or their country. So this is important for us understanding the immigration story. So what can you do? What can you do? There's really 3 options since you can't control country of birth and parents, right? What can you do? 1, you can move up with effort or luck, right, within your country if the country has a lot of social mobility, right? If the country has good supports and so on, and you can become what you want to become, you can move up within the country that you were born into, right? But this can't play a huge role for you because 80% of income is explained by country of birth, right? But it can play some. 2, you can hope that your whole country develops and moves up, right? So that everyone's getting richer and sort of richer, rising tide lifts all boats phenomenon. But again, even if combined with the first one, right? Even if you're moving up and your whole country is moving up, you're still working against about 80% of explained variation in income. So by yourself, not much can be done, unfortunately. And this is a more sort of humbling aspect of the talk. So if you can hope that the country moves up, you can hope that you have ambition and you find the right openings and you move up in your own personal socioeconomic status. But both of those are relatively limited compared to option 3, which offers the possibility of moving to where your labor can be paid at a higher rate. Those are the 3 options, right? Hope the country moves up, hope you move up individually, or you can move and move up very quickly just by moving, just by having a chance at a higher income with your skills, right? So what would you do is the question. Which one would you hope for? If you're the immigrant, and again, these are not easy questions to resolve, but social science is one thing, the moral ethical parts kind of are another, right? What would you do? What would you do? on the personal side of things, my ancestors did move, and they moved from Europe, Pennsylvania and Ohio, into the South, some of them, and then some of them on my father's side settled in central Kansas near Chase, Kansas on the Santa Fe Trail. They moved. They chose option 3. The home country, right, clearly wasn't getting it done. They may have had personal ambitions and personal characteristics that allowed them to get ahead, but they chose option 3. They chose to come to the place where that allowed much greater upward mobility than the old country. And so the picture on the front slide, this is my great grandfather who homesteaded in Chase in 1873, and his wife, and these are my relatives. The person here number 6 is actually my grandfather father, and my grandfather is now going to be 99 this fall. So they chose option 3. Many Americans who are many of our ancestors, if you're American, are of this story. The immigrant story is a part of the country, and we've always fought about it. And I've thought a lot about that guy back to the beginning that I met on the bus in Juarez, Mexico, in my work as I've studied immigration over time as a social scientist, but it always has stayed with me. What's the real difference between that guy and me? Very smart guy, very capable, very hardworking, was selling food on the bus. He came through the buses. What was the difference? The difference is that I can come up with, it's not rational, it's not a logical answer, it's just that I won the birth lottery. That I happen to have been born on the north side of a border rather than the south side of the border. And I didn't get a choice over that. And it easily, right, very easily, because of chance, could have been the other way around. And I could have been selling the food on the bus, and he could have been the PhD student interviewing me, but it wasn't that way. So the what would you do question is one that stays with me, and maybe it stays with you as we think about immigration and immigrants in particular, and the story that they provide as part of our national story. And the other thing that stood out to me from this individual I met in Mexico is this picture on the right. Is this is a drawing of the border between Tijuana and San Diego. There's another one between El Paso and Juarez. Lines that humans draw on maps, but lines that don't actually exist when you zoom out and look at Earth. Earth actually, looks like that. That's the reality, right? Is that we draw lines in the sands, and those lines have everything to do with what we can and cannot become, but about which we did not get any choice. And so I wanted to leave you with that question about choice and who gets to choose and what would you do after all the facts and figures, because I think it's an important one to consider when we're thinking about immigration and immigrants in Kansas and the United States moving ahead. We're one big, messy, complicated, wonderful, terrifying, inspiring experiment in self-government and identity and development, really. And immigration is a glimpse into this project. So thank you very much for your time and attention. And I will turn it back over to Amanda, I believe, at this point for any questions or comments that come through. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Talk about perspective. The chance lottery, I've not seen those numbers before, and that was amazing. So we have had a couple questions come through. In your data sets,
Sure.
have you looked into separating out refugees?
Oh, yes. So that's a good question. So the data I present here in this are only inclusive of immigrants, not refugees. Refugees who are counted separately. And the main distinguishing feature, of course, between the two is choice. Refugees we count as people who move because of a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of one of the protected classes, race, religion, so on. Immigrants are counted as classified more as economic migrants or economic movers, and they're presumed to have a choice. They're coming for work. They're coming to immigrate here. But in the data, so that's the short answer, is this that nothing to do with refugees tonight, only immigrants. But of course, in the data, there has to be a gray area between choice over whether you're moving from a war-torn country, but you're coming here for work. Were you fleeing war or were you looking for work? Well, probably both, but you get counted one way or another at the border, right? It's a good question.
So do all of these statistics come like from ICE or Immigration Customs Enforcement, or
Yes,
before ICE, where did they come from?
Yeah, so the INS, ICE, then Department of Homeland Security, but census data predominate in this presentation, U.S. Census data.
All right. And do your numbers take into account as the U.S. was expanding? I'm not sure I understand this question. Because as the U.S. expanded, they would have taken in like people that the border crossed.
I don't fully understand it, but I can.
Yeah.
I see a question. Yeah. I don't fully understand that one. I'm sorry. Oh, people at the border crossed. So, for example, is the person, I'm guessing, right? Is the person referencing the fact that much of the Western United States was actually a part of Mexico before we actually annexed Mexico? So the border crossed them, not they crossed the border. Yes, absolutely. So, of course, much of the western part of the United States, Utah and so on, west, was Mexico. And in that case, because of the U.S. occupying more and more of the country, the border actually crossed a fair number of people who were then considered immigrants. Very good point, right? Again, national policies are very important for understanding how we classify who is in and who is not and who gets to say. Very good point. The whole nother talk about the history of, that's the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican-American War and so on, but very good point.
All right, and then our last question, why did so many Germans choose Kansas, or were there equal numbers of Germans immigrating to every state?
That was a good point. So the short answer is German immigrants were predominant in a lot of areas of the United States, not just Kansas. And that's because in the old country, there was religious discrimination, there was conflict, and there was outmigration of Germans to the United States during a particular time. Kansas was caught up in a lot of those flows. I mean, if you're talking about the Midwest, you would see very similar patterns in Nebraska, in Iowa, for example. But as you get up into the upper Midwest, you would get into more of the Scandinavian flows. But at a national level, German immigrants predominated at the time that Kansas was being settled.
All right, excellent. Well, it is 8 o'clock.
Yes.
So we are out of time. So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And thank you to the Johnson County Library staff who helped make this program possible. Thank you all so much for attending the program today. Please let us know through the poll on the screen where you heard about this program so we know where to advertise in the future. Our next, the Past is Prologue program, will be on Wichita's Dockham Drugstore sit-in. This will be presented by Prissa Barnes Thursday, March 10th at 7 p.m. So thank you for attending, and we hope to see you at our next program.